Hey guys, it's Dr. Raymond. Thank you so much for watching my YouTube channel and welcome to our Rise and Grind to Shine bright and early Monday morning inspiration as we continue our discussion on faith. As usual, before we get started, for those of you that like to follow along, you can go to my website at www.themedicalinstituteforwellness.com. The link is in the description. Click on Wellness Corner on the upper left hand side and it will redirect you to another page where there's a big green button that says click here, and you will click there, and for free you can download the PDFs of all of our devotionals in this series. Well, actually, some of you watched my video from Friday, my vlog, and I am in a hotel with very limited access. I'm doing virtually everything on my phone. So I actually only uploaded today's devotional. I'm gonna go home this weekend. I will rectify it and upload all of the previous devotions, including the new one for next week. So I'm sorry for that, just bear with me. But with that being said, let's get right into it. So this is part 2 of last week's discussion, the power of confession. You shall have whatsoever you say. And our text for today can be found in Numbers chapter 14, verses 2 through 3, verse 11, and then verses 22 through 24. And as I said, this is part 2 of last week. And last week we discussed how our words have tremendous power, and in them lies death and life, depending on the words that we choose to speak. So in essence, the words that we speak determine if we live a life filled with doubt that ultimately results in unfulfilled purpose, or if we live a life full of faith that leads to full manifestation of all of the things that we are believing God for. So today we're going to discuss 2 people, Joshua and Caleb, in the Bible that exemplified this principle of the power of confession and are role models for not only how we should speak, but also how we should think as believers. And a little bit of background information: Joshua was ultimately the successor of Moses, and he was a mighty man of God, as was Caleb. And their journey of faith can be found starting in Numbers chapter 13, which I strongly urge you to read on your own, but we'll do a little bit of brief synopsis here. So the review is that the children of Israel were slaves in Egypt for several hundred years, but God, through the hands of Moses, delivered them in a miraculous way with 10 plagues on the Egyptians and the ultimate demise of Pharaoh, whose main purpose was to oppress and enslave them. But prior to bringing them out of Egypt, God speaks to Moses, and he promises Moses to not only bring the people out of slavery and out of Egypt, but to bring them to a place of divine blessing. And we see that in Exodus chapter 3, verse 7 through 8, which is God's promise concerning the children of Israel. And he says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. Let us just give praise to God for that he knows everything. There is nothing that hits our life that he's caught by surprise, that he doesn't already know, and evidenced here that he doesn't already have a plan in place to bring us out of tough times into a place of amazing blessing. And he continues on to say, so I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. The Israelites were well aware of this promise and their distinction as precious children of God. And throughout their journey out of Egypt to the promised land, they experience phenomenal blessing from God in the form of the Word of God and the Ten Commandments, and just so many amazing miracles. They received heavenly provision of food daily from God. They would literally walk out of their tent and there was a manna from heaven every day for them to eat, except on the Sabbath, when the day prior to the Sabbath, God gave them a double portion so they could gather and have food to eat. So they never went without. They experienced divine healing. And they even experienced getting water from a rock when they had no way or shape or form to get water and became thirsty in the desert. So God always provided for them, and not only that, He provided in many miraculous ways. So as they prepare to take possession of the land, God speaks to Moses, and Moses in turn chooses 12 spies, one from each tribe of Israel, which includes Joshua and Caleb, and their job is to go into the land and just survey it and its inhabitants. And after 40 days of surveying the land, they come back with a report to give to Moses, and they give this report in front of the entire nation of Israel. And we see that report in Numbers chapter 13, starting in verse 27, which says, "Thus they told him and said, we went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey. And this is its fruit." They presented just a crazy big clusters of grapes that multiple people had to carry because they were so enormous. Nevertheless, pay special attention to this. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. The land through which we have gone and spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. There also we saw the Nephilim. The sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim, giants. And we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. And this is the key. Proverbs 23 verse 7, which we have already gone over several times now. As a man thinks within himself, so is he. Consequently, and as we talked in our last lesson, if our minds are not renewed, then we cannot be transformed. And if we are not transformed by the renewing of our minds through the reading of the Word of God, then we have a faulty, inaccurate belief system. And this faulty belief system will ultimately lead us to speak negativity in words full of doubt that ultimately become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And as I said when I was reading to it, pay special attention to verse 28 when they say nevertheless, because prior to them saying nevertheless, they confirm God's blessing and His word previously spoken that yes, this is a great land, a land flowing with milk and honey. But with that one word, nevertheless, they completely negate the promise of God and forfeit the blessing that God spoke over their lives. And what is crazy to me here is that they just confirmed that what God spoke is true. But in saying nevertheless, they believe one part of the blessing, that yes, this is a good land, it flows with milk and honey, but then they completely negate the second part of the blessing, that it is theirs for the taking. And if God was faithful to bring them out of Egypt, to bring them to this land, and everything that He said about the land was true, why couldn't they believe Him that they would ultimately possess the land? God himself then becomes so fed up with the people's constant unbelief. This is not just an isolated incident. Throughout their entire journey, they spoke nothing but doubt and negativity. And he became so fed up that he swore that their words would come true and they would die in the wilderness. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. Their words became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Not because the land wasn't theirs, it was, but they refused to enter in by refusing to accept the promise that God had already given them. And so now we're going to pick up in our text, Exodus chapter 14, verses 2 through 3, 11, and then verses 21 through 24. I misspoke earlier, I said 22. And it says, all the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Abraham, and the whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? This is so crazy, and not to mention trifling. The Lord said to Moses, how long will this people spurn me? And how long will they not believe in me, despite all the signs which I have performed in their midst? But indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. Surely all men who have seen my glory and my signs, which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not listened to my voice, shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who spurned me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land which he entered, and his descendants shall take possession of it. So what we see here is that the people refuse to believe, and they begin to grumble and complain, not just against Moses, but also against God. And we also see here that they got two separate reports. They got a report from the 10 spies, which was full of doubt, but they also had Joshua and Caleb's report that was full of faith. But yet and still they clung to the report of doubt. And to add insult to injury, they wanted to go back to Egypt. This is clear evidence of a mind that is not renewed. They would have rather been second-class citizens, oppressed and abused, rather than become the kings and queens that God designed for them to become. And to not be subservient, but to take possession of an entire territory, to be owners, not slaves. So ultimately we see that God lost complete patience with them, and they ate the fruit of their words, and they died in the wilderness. However, Joshua and Caleb, through their confession of faith, were the only two out of the millions of people that left Egypt, including Moses, that were able to enter into the promised land that God had promised to give them so many years before. That is so crazy to me. All of the people, the millions of people that left Egypt, two, and of course the following generation. So the people that wandered in the wilderness had children. That generation entered in, but the old generation that actually came out of Egypt, only Joshua and Caleb, 2 out of millions, entered into the promise of God. And it is the saddest thing in the world to be so close to a breakthrough, so close to experiencing the manifestation of God's word spoken to us in the past, but yet to walk away empty-handed because we refuse to receive due to our unbelief. And so many times we balk at the audacity, the lack of faith, and the immaturity of the children of Israel, but we so oftentimes succumb to the same type of scenarios in our lives. I can honestly say that a large portion of my life as a believer was spent living just like this. I was able to experience so many blessings and miracles from God, but yet when it really came down to it, I walked in fear and doubt. I had so much anxiety and had a really hard time believing God for all the things that I knew that He wanted to give me, things that He had spoken to me as a child. I just had a hard time believing God for Him, and ultimately didn't receive because I didn't believe. And some of us, we, and myself included, I could believe God for some things. I could believe God for salvation, that He died for my sins. I could believe God for healing. But then I would have a hard time trusting Him with my finances. Or some of us can trust God with our finances, but we have a hard time trusting Him with our relationships. And I want to urge you today to be a Joshua and a Caleb in this unbelieving generation. It is high time that we start believing God for the impossible, and we believe Him for everything, not just half of it. We are either going to believe God for it all or not at all. As the prophet Elijah inquired in 1 Kings chapter 18 verse 21, how long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, then follow Him. No longer do we need to hesitate between faith and doubt. One day we're believing God for all the things that He's promised us, and the next day we're down in the dumps and we just have a negative attitude and we don't believe that God is true to His word. It's time that we stop it. If God is God, then we will follow Him, and if we follow Him, we need to go after it wholeheartedly. The Bible tells us that we walk by faith and not by sight. So our circumstances, what people say, what we see should not move us. The only thing that should move us is what God has already spoken, and what He has already spoken will come to pass if we just continue to walk in it. So we should only be moved by our faith. We should be steadfast and unmovable in those things that we are believing God for. And so this week and in the weeks to come, I want you to look firmly at the lives of Joshua and Caleb as an example of how we should live our lives. And know that because of their confession of faith, they, out of millions of people, were able to enter into the promise of God. So know today, we shall have whatsoever we say. And from here on out, we need to make sure that every word that leaves our tongue is one full of faith, and that perfectly aligns with the Word of God and what He says concerning our lives. Not our circumstances, not what we see, and definitely not the opinions of others. So that concludes our devotional for today. I hope that you were blessed by this message. And I just really want to urge you to shake off doubt and discouragement and negativity. I'm not saying that it's easy. In fact, this week, that's all I have been experiencing every day. For most of the week, I have woken up with just fear trying to grip my heart and discouragement. But I know that the word says that the devil is the father of lies, and he's the accuser of the brethren. Every time I woke up this week, it was always, you can't do this because of this in the past, or you can't have this because of this. And that is not true. It doesn't line up with the word of God. Next week we are going to discuss our thought life and how we can really change our thought life to reflect God's thoughts for us. But as you go on this week, I really encourage you to shake off the doubt and the negativity, shed the habitual behaviors of negative self-talk. And as always, I pray that you be well, that you be inspired to believe God for the impossible things in your life. And I hope that you join me next week as we continue our discussion on faith, and we discuss how we can change our negative thought life into one that is positive. Be blessed and have an amazing week. And I pray that this be a week of amazing blessings, and that as you begin to believe God with your whole heart, that you experience miracles in a way that you have never received before. And that, as I've spoken in previous videos, that God said to me earlier this year, and I want you to experience this as well, that eyes have not seen, ears have not heard, neither has entered into the hearts of man all the things that God has in store for us who love him. I'll see you soon.